This is P.Y. Lalita Chaitanya, lecturer in Commerce, Government City College. Today's topic is legal rules of valid consideration. Let us move on to the definition. Consideration. According to Pullak, consideration is the price for which the promise of other is bought and promise thus given for the value is enforceable. For instance, C agrees to sell a bike to D for rupees 1500. In this case, cost is the consideration for D and price is the consideration for C. Consideration is found to be an essential element of a contract and is regarded as the backbone. It enables in creating the legal rights between both the parties. A law enforces only those promises which are made for consideration due to the fact that voluntary promises are mostly made roughly and without any due interest. For example, if C promises to pay D rupees 200 for nothing, D is neither doing nor promising to do anything in return to compensate C for his money. C's promise has no force in law. Let us move on to the legal rules of lawful consideration. The legal rules of essential elements of valid consideration are as follows. The first one is it must move at the desire of the promisor. An act compromising consideration must be made at the desire or appeal of the promisor. If in case it is made at the instance of third party, then it will not be regarded as an effective consideration. For example, C saved goods of D from fire without being asked for help. So, in this case, C cannot demand payment for the service provided by him. So, always consideration must move at the desire of the promisor. Let us move on to the second point. It may move from promisee or any other person. Here, the promisee is nothing but acceptor. As per the English law, consideration must move from the promisee. Whereas, according to the Indian law, consideration must move from the promisee or any other person, that is even a stranger. It means that where there is a consideration for a promise, then there is no need to know as to whom it has been furnished. But the stranger to consideration would be liable to sue only when he or she is a party to the contract. Let us move on to the third point. It may be due act, absentees, or forbearance or written promise. The good considerations for a contract are as follows. So, if a consideration must be good, so some of the list will be there. Here we have to follow. Some of the rules will be there to follow that. The first point is forbearance to sue. Here, forbearance is nothing but courtesy. When an individual has the possibility to sue another for the purpose of enforcement of right but agrees not to sue his or her claim, then such situation would compromise a good consideration for a promise made by the other individual. This in turn provides benefit to the individual who has not been sued and determined or damage to the individual who could sue. For example, C owes rupees 200 at 10% PA from D, but fails to pay the amount. When D is about to file a suit, C readily accepts to pay the higher rate of interest to D, and D by perceiving this does not file the suit. Here, the forbearance of D to file a suit is good consideration, and D can enforce the promise by C to pay the high rate of interest to D itself. Let us move on to the next point, compromise of a dispute claim. What do you mean by compromise of dispute claim means? Let us see. Compromise is a form of forbearance. The same principle of forbearance is applicable on the bona fide compromise of disputed claim. Despite that, claim may appear to be without any basis. It is considered that the claim must be reasonable and claiming a person must be genuinely believe the claim to be a valid claim, and he or she should act as a bona fide. Other party can claim compensation when it finds out that the claim was unlawful, illegal, and the claim was not a bona fide. So this is also one of the compromise of a disputed claim is also one of the essential element for lawful consideration. Let us move on to the third point, composition with creditors. Composition with creditors means a debtor who is not finally sound may conduct a meeting of his creditors and would make an appeal to give their acceptance of a lesser amount in satisfaction of their debt. When creditors agree to the proposal made by the debtor, then the agreement is binding on both the debtor and the creditor, and this in turn contributes to a compromise of the claims of the creditors. Now, let us move on to the fourth point. Consideration must be always consideration may be past, present, or future. According to section 2D, past consideration is nothing but if a consideration by one party for a current promise was given in the past or before the date of the promise, then it is termed as a past consideration. Means if a consideration by a party for a current promise was given in the past or before the date of the promise, then it is known as a past consideration. Let us move on to the present considerations. A present or executed consideration takes place when consideration is provided along with the promise, that is, during the time of the promise. For example, in cash sale, consideration is present or executed. Next comes under the future consideration. A future or executory consideration takes place when consideration from one party to the another party is to pass simultaneously for the formation of the contract is known as a future consideration. Let us move on to the fifth point. It need not be adequate. Adequate is nothing but satisfactory or acceptable. So, it need not be adequate means as a consideration is something in return, but in reality it may not be equal to the value of something given. According to this law, contract should be supported by consideration. It is observed that adequacy of the consideration is for both the parties to indulge at the time of making the agreement, but not for the court when it is about to be enforced. Even though consideration need not be adequate to the promise, but it must be of certain value in front of law. Always consideration must be something to which the law may provide some value. The consideration need not be equal in the value to the promise made, but the court may not be responsible to repay back the bad bargains. The court will not provide bargains for the parties to a suit, and suppose a person obtains what he or she contracted for will not inquire regarding the promise which he has given was equivalent in returns. Next, move on to the sixth point. It must be real and not illusory. Illusory is nothing but real, not real. A consideration must be always in real, competent, and also of certain value in the eyes of law. When this reality is missing, then the consideration cannot be accepted. So consideration must be real, competent, and also of a certain value in the eyes of law, even though it may be inadequate. The real consideration is not present in the following cases. There are some cases where the consideration is not present. So let us see that what are the cases consideration is missing. Physical impossibility. Move on to the point, physical impossibility. Let us move on to the one example for the physical impossibility. For example, C promises D to put a life into D's dead wife, and for which D must pay him ₹1,000. Here, C's promise is physically impossible to perform because already the wife was died, so we cannot put the life to the dead person. So here it is impossible to get back the life of a person. So that's why in this case the physically it is impossible. So here the real consideration is not present over here. Next, let us move on to where the real consideration is not present. The second important second point where the consideration is not present. Legal impossibility. Here we'll move on to example. C hires D for specific work and promises to pay a reasonable amount as there is no recognized technique for determining the reasonable remuneration. Here, the promise made by the C is unenforceable as the consideration is found to be uncertain. Next, move on to the illusory consideration. Illusory is just now we have discussed. Illusory is nothing but real. Illusory, not real consideration. For example, illusory consideration is just now we have discussed. They were already in agreement to bring back the consideration, and which is not real. So we cannot make a real consideration in illusory consideration. Let us move on to the seventh point. It must be something which the promisor is not already bound to do. Means under general law, by an existing contract, a promise to do what one is already tend to do is not a good consideration for new promise, as it adds nothing to the pre-existing legal or contractual obligation. Even a promise to carry out a public service or a duty by public servant is regarded as the consideration. Let us move on to the last point. It must not be illegal. It must not be illegal, immoral, or opposite to public policy. So, as per section 23, consideration for an agreement must not be unlawful. When the agreement is unlawful, the court do not permit any action on the agreement. Thank you. Save.